And so to start us off, I'm going to reintroduce Dale Simon to you. Dale, tell us what we're here for today.
Right, so good afternoon everyone and welcome to our domestic abuse webinar. During this session we're going to be looking at some of the key messages from the domestic abuse briefing which was put out in September of last year. But we're also, more importantly, I think, going to just hear from some... Oops, I'm not sure if someone's has got their mic on because I'm going to...
There is some background noise. Sorry, Dale. There is some background noise. Please just put your machine on the mic on mute until you want to speak. Thank you. Sorry, Dale.
Yeah, so we're going to give an overview of the briefing which went out in September. But as I said, more importantly, we want to really give an opportunity to have some discussion here about practice and give some time for you to talk about any questions or issues, emerging good practice that's going on in your areas. So it's actually a learning and interactive session. So I'm sorry, I'm seeing the slide 6. All right, I want the slide with the people faces on it. Yes, thank you. Right, so as I've said, I'm Dale. I've been on the panel since its inception in June of 2018. This slide really just shows the existing panel members and our purpose. And with me this afternoon, in addition to the members that you see there, Annie Hudson, our chair, Simon Bailey, Jenny Coles, Isabel Trowler, Sally Shearer, Peter and Susan, Peter Sidebottom and Susan, is Renica. And Renica, if you want to just quickly come off of mute and say hello.
Hello, I'm Renica Gerardi-Dent and yes, sit on the panel. I'm a psychologist by profession. Thank you, Dale.
Yeah. And as I say, the panel consists, I hope you all know now, of a variety of professionals from different backgrounds who look at complex issues in relation to child safeguarding practice. Okay, next slide. Okay, so as you know, as I've said, that just want to talk now briefly about the background that led to us undertaking the briefing, and I'm going to deal with this in quite short order because I'm assuming most of you, if not all of you, have already read the review. So it's really about kind of learning and practice since that review. And I should have also said, sorry, in my intros, that we've also got on the webinar with us Janine Davies, who's one of the panel members as well. Janine, do you want to quickly say hello as well?
Yes, hi everyone, my name is Janine Davis, joined panel November 2021, background in exploitation and child sexual abuse with a specific focus on racialised communities and adultification bias.
Thank you. Okay, so in terms of the background to the review itself, in 2020, domestic abuse was a factor in 40% of the cases notified to panel. And so I'm going to just go through this at quite some high level. So I, as the lead, as someone with a background in domestic abuse, I was asked to lead this piece of work on behalf of the panel, and we commissioned Althea Cribb and Sarah Lawrence from our pool of reviewers to conduct the review. Both Sarah and Althea are consultants with vast experience of working in the fields of domestic abuse and safeguarding children. The objectives of the review were to consider the effectiveness of multi-agency join-up, what works and the gaps in understanding prevalence, relationships with other harms and services for children who are victims, and how services and practices can be improved to support children as victims. The review process itself was very detailed and consisted of a case review of a mixture of different types of cases that had been submitted to the panel, a rapid literature review, meetings with national and local stakeholders, consideration of over 50 written submissions from stakeholders, and also meetings and discussions with 30 areas who were developing practice, and a national survey, which we received some 94 responses to. So in addition to the sort of volume of domestic abuse cases that were coming into the panel, we were also very mindful when we started this project, which I should say was very much a review project rather than a full-blown national review. What we often do is try to assess the size and the questions that we want to ask before commissioning any form of national review. So when we were thinking about the piece of work, we were also very mindful of the recent implementation of the Domestic Abuse Act, which obviously formally made children victims in their own right of domestic abuse that had been perpetrated against their parents or carers. So we were also really interested to understand what, if any, changes had been made by safeguarding partners in recognition of the Act. And I think the final thing I want to say before I hand over to Althea, who's going to go through the review's findings and recommendations, is that in terms of the definition of domestic abuse that we used, obviously we're mindful that the Domestic Abuse Act introduces a statutory definition of domestic abuse, which encompasses single incidents and courses of conduct. But for the purposes of the review project, we understood controlling and coercive behaviours to be core to the domestic abuse as separate from non-controlling conflict. So I'm sure when Althea talks about the findings and recommendations, she'll expand that a bit more. So I'm now going to, that's a real whistle stop of the background, but as I say, we can pick up any more detailed questions at the end. And I'm now going to hand over to Althea, who's going to talk about the review's findings and recommendations.
Thanks so much, Dale. And I'm speaking today, but my colleague Sarah Lawrence is also on the call but unable to speak. But we were both felt hugely privileged to be able to be part of this work for the panel, and it was an amazing piece of work to do, and just heard from so many people across the country and a real kind of appetite for kind of looking in detail at this kind of work. So I'm just going to run through really briefly the findings and then the recommendations, and I will be very brief as we've kind of emphasised in terms of having time for Q&A and discussion, and obviously you'll see what we found in the briefing. So we've brought together our findings into different themes. A significant theme that we started with was kind of lack of a whole system response to domestic abuse and child safeguarding. So seeing the two as often quite two distinct issues in terms of system responses and in terms of how partnerships and organisations approach them. And that came through in a number of different areas. We started with the case file audit, looking at those 72 reviews, and then the findings that we had from that, we really kind of checked those out and explored them with colleagues, with partners, and through the academic search as well. So this came from all of those different things that Dale summarised. So a minimal use of MARAC in relation to the child safeguarding system. It was seen as a referral point for high-risk adult victims, but not necessarily integrated with responses to children at risk. There was a use of Operation Encompass, which for those of you who aren't aware of that, is where notifications of incidents of domestic abuse that have been reported to police get sent on to the school that child attends, but kind of not really clear, a lot of areas not always really clear what was the purpose of that, what we were aiming to get out of that, and it didn't necessarily lead to much joined up working in many areas. A real emphasis from the safeguarding system that the response to domestic abuse, the multi-agency response to domestic abuse, was centred on the MASH, the multi-agency safeguarding hub, or the front door, those kind of initial notifications or referrals coming through, but that didn't necessarily lead to a kind of wider kind of system response to the domestic abuse and child safeguarding concerns, but tended to be about managing the volume of notifications. So the process was more about the volume of notifications from police rather than building a comprehensive picture of what was going on in that family in order to safeguard the children. The rare use of specialist domestic abuse services, of the 72 reviews that we looked at, given that they all referred to domestic abuse, not one of them involved a specialist domestic abuse service in the review process. And we saw in the cases that were being reviewed also that specialist domestic abuse services were seen as the referral or signposting point, but not something to be integrated within the child safeguarding system. And obviously we know that although funding is increasing around responses to children and young people, those services tend to be commissioned to focus on adults. So they were seen kind of very much in that kind of adult space rather than having a role in relation to child safeguarding. Incident-driven responses, so this is where kind of confusion in many areas between what's domestic abuse and what's parental conflict. So although we looked at 72 cases that mentioned domestic abuse, in some cases that was all that was said. So there was no exploration as to what was going on, and we didn't get that whole picture of what was domestic abuse, and a real focus on the most recent incident. And as Dale said, we were approaching this as an understanding of domestic abuse as around a pattern of behaviour, something that the adult and child victims are living with 24/7 from the abuser, not just about whatever has most recently been reported, but that tended to be the focus. That was what mattered in terms of the safeguarding system response. So not really gathering information from the whole family about the whole situation. And that domestic abuse, so any kind of conflict tended to just be named as domestic abuse. So as if we say there's domestic abuse, first of all, it always means the same thing. And secondly, that everybody knows what that means. And obviously we know that that's not a helpful way to see it. So you'll see that some of these sort of build on each other and connect together. They're not all completely distinct themes. So that focus on the most recent incident, we also kind of understood that in the context, not understanding controlling and coercive behaviour, and actually not really exploring it, not looking for it, and thereby not being able to rule it out and say, okay, actually this is conflict rather than controlling and coercive behaviour. So there's a real absence of that. Emphasis on physical violence as either the key indicator or the only indicator of domestic abuse, and particularly as the key indicator of risk of harm to children. So not seeing how damaging living with an abuser who is using controlling and coercive behaviours is for children, but just only seeing that the physical violence is the thing that harms children, not seeing that whole picture. And as I said, sometimes domestic abuse just is named, but so actually we didn't always know who was doing what to whom. Where it was named, the vast majority were mothers being abused by the child's father or her male partner. There may have been instances of other kinds of situations of violence and abuse, but we didn't know because it just said domestic abuse. So we didn't know who was doing what to whom, which really questions as to whether the people who were managing that case knew who was doing what to whom. And particularly that kind of conflation of domestic abuse and conflict, we saw that post-separation and around child contact, even when there had been really significant domestic abuse from the father to the mother in the past, once they'd separated, which was often seen as the only route for safeguarding children, even though the children continued to have contact with that abusive parent beyond. That as soon as separation occurred, it was child contact disputes. It wasn't post-separation abuse. It wasn't a continuation of that controlling and coercive behaviour, which obviously really made invisible the impact that controlling and coercive behaviour was having on those children in those child contact situations. So through all of that, with that kind of lack of naming, lack of identification, what we really saw, what was persistent, was that failure to name the person causing the harm. So where we saw there's domestic abuse in the home, there's a domestic abuse risk, it's a domestic abuse relationship, she's being abused, the perpetrator was. And I think we referred, to the panel's previous fantastic report around non-accidental injury to under ones and that myth of invisible men that came through really strongly. They were absolutely not invisible. They were completely present, but they weren't the focus of the work, even though they were the cause of the harm to the children. So, and as I said, if there was a harm, it was related to physical violence. It wasn't the harm of living with somebody using those controlling and coercive behaviours. And this led to mothers being made responsible for what was going on. It was up to them to take responsibility for the whole situation, to leave, ideally, even though we know that there's significant risk when people leave abusive partners, but that somehow they were responsible for stopping the harm being caused by the children's father or the male partner. And actually, and that really kind of led to the harm that was caused to the children in these reviews and backed up by the research that we found. So that children were being significantly harmed or killed by fathers or male partners who had also been abusive to mothers, but that connection wasn't seen. The impact on children at different ages, so the older children got, the less they were seen as harmed by the domestic abuse. The further away from the domestic abuse that they'd experienced, the less they were seen as victims of domestic abuse, even though that potentially had a really big impact on them as young children. Now they're teenagers, that's history, that's no longer relevant. But you could see that all of that had built up to an impact on them, particularly for those teenagers who were self-harming, at risk of exploitation, or those who were trying or had successfully taken their own lives. And that was really that absence of ongoing or long-term support. So beyond the need for a safeguarding response, that need for children and young people to have space to recover from their experiences alongside the non-abusive parent and contact with the other parent. We really wanted to have findings in relation to these areas, so I'm just going to touch on it really briefly and not go through it in detail, but there was a real lack of, and this is looking particularly at the case file audit rather than research. There is quite a lot of research in these areas that we were able to draw on. What we weren't able to do is say, from our case file audit, this is what we were able to find. In some cases, because there was a total lack of recording or data, so we couldn't say. There may have been a greater diversity of cases that we looked at, but it wasn't recorded in the case review, or it hadn't been recorded in the case notes that the review was looking at. Where it was recorded, there was a real lack of analysis as to what that meant, what it mean for this family to have these experiences in the context of their wider societal position, the discrimination and oppression they may have experienced, and kind of seeing that as part of that system response. So I'll just look quickly at the 4 core principles. Again, this is in the briefing. I'm conscious of time, so I won't go into them in detail, but seeing them all as very closely, obviously connected and complementary to each other. It's not one or the other, but I won't go into them in detail because I know that's in the briefing and I know we want to move on. So lastly, the recommendations really speak to what we found in terms of that disconnect from the system. Domestic abuse or violence against women and girls partnerships in one place, trying to start to look at children as victims, child safeguarding partnerships in another place, potentially looking at domestic abuse, possibly not, maybe getting a report once a year from the domestic abuse partnership, but not integrated together, and looking at these as very closely connected systems that needed to be kind of approaching children and families collectively. Again, that involvement of specialist domestic abuse services I touched on, the need to look beyond the front door when we're looking at multi-agency safeguarding. It's not just about those notifications coming through, it's that much bigger picture for children and families. And then, so training as always, and involving services, specialist services in reviews, so not just involving them in the system, but involving them in reviews felt really important from what we looked at, and obviously looking at and recording the protected characteristics for each family member and how it might be different for each family member, but also looking at the experiences of the wider family, their whole situation and the whole context for them, and how that relates to the domestic abuse that that person is either perpetrating or being the victim of. So I'm going to stop there. I know that was a rattling through, but I'll take a look at the questions in a moment. Thanks. I think I'll hand back to Steve. I'm not sure who I'm handing it over to next.
That's perfect. Thanks, Althea. So, yeah, but it certainly stimulated a number of different reactions and responses. If I just quickly summarize them to give you a chance just to take a breath. So first of all, you hit a note with the Think Family webinar that we previously ran, and all the webinars will be available through the National Panel site, so we can you can review those and have a look at them and get the questions and answers as well. Then we talked about, there's a question number 26 in the forum. I do agree with the use of MARAC. There could be an example of plenty of what we are deemed low-level domestic abuse instances, and consideration should then be given to referral to MARAC. So there's a point at which the you become aware of the problem. There are some more instances around the impact of domestic abuse specialists, number 32. I agree that domestic abuse specialists are seen as a signpost. How do we as professionals ensure that we consider what barriers there may be to a person accessing this? Consideration on how this could impact on the children in the home. So 2 things there about the seriousness of the incident and the access to Marek. Response? You got a quick response to that, Althea?
Oh, yes, very quickly. I mean, obviously the challenge with Marek is that it's only legal to share information about domestic abuse victims when they are assessed, identified as being at high risk. But I think it really, that question really speaks to a need for parallel systems along, not seeing the Marek as that's our multi-agency. But like we said, with the front door, okay, that's our multi-agency response to children and domestic abuse. We don't want to see Marek as the be all and end all for our multi-agency response to adults and domestic abuse. So it's thinking it is that whole system response that we need to be looking at, not just high risk, not just looking at one member of the family, but looking collectively. And then I think domestic abuse specialists, I mean, I just think there needs to be that dialogue. It is about that dialogue, and I think there is appetite on both sides from everybody that we spoke to within the research to have those conversations. And I think if the domestic abuse specialists and the child safeguarding specialists across whichever organisation they're in are having conversations about who's doing what their role is, and how they can work together, I think that can only benefit the children in the home, because actually what it flags is support that might be needed for the adult victim, support for the adult abuser, and then kind of what support is out there for those children and young people. And as I said, it's often that those services are not commissioned to work with children and young people, so it starts to flag up those gaps as well. But I think, yeah, those barriers are reduced by professionals talking to each other, understanding who's doing what that can provide for different members of the family, so that then safeguarding professionals, when they're encountering those family members, can have real in-depth conversations about, this is what the specialist services do, is that right for you? What else might be out there?
Yeah, thank you. Just making note, thank you, Louise Hammer from Lancashire and South Cumbria. You've put in a little, indeed, a cut and paste of a slide into the chat as well. Thanks for that. This is about the recently used fire triangle in training to try and get across the message about long-term impact of trauma associated with domestic violence, DA and adolescent safeguarding and CCE. So please, this is the opportunity for everybody to share what is emerging as good practice, or what you're hopeful of will crack some of the issues. There is a comment about the, well, a question in it's number 36. In areas where police reports were shared directly with health, did the review note any positive impact on the sharing across the agencies? So that's 2 very specific, but the wider thing about where safeguarding practices were better connected, what was the impact?
We didn't see police reports being shared directly with health, except for at the MASH, except for at that front door, and that was really variable in terms of the resources that health were able to give to that front door, and that was very patchy. So I wouldn't want to say anything conclusive in terms of the positives or the impact. I think it's definitely, when there is space, when there are resources for a dedicated member of staff from health, they could bring a lot of insight and then connect with health colleagues. It places a huge demand on those, on that health person. But I wouldn't want to, I'm sorry, I don't think I'd be able to say anything conclusive, because it didn't come through kind of hugely, but others might be able to share any experiences as well.
And I can just confirm, I mean, since the review, I don't think we've had any examples of that either. So it wasn't captured in our review, and I can't think of the top of my head of any cases where that's been a factor, where we've seen direct information being shared.
Okay, and thank you. Sarah Lawrence has already responded to that with the same tone. So just one final question, then we can pick them up in the longer Q&A we've got after the next presentation. You mentioned Operation Encompass, but this is so varied from area to area, especially where it concerns sixth form colleges receiving no information. I've also seen them that just say police were called and no more. So again, we've had a response to that, but there's, any more about Operation Encompass, Althea?
I think it does vary widely. Well, and I think it is that, kind of that notification goes, but and some areas had a bit more of a process. They might have even had a member of staff within safeguarding who was responsible for getting those notifications, passing them on to school, passing on information to the school about what they could do. But I think there was a real concern that it could raise the risk if schools start to address things without the adequate training, or that there's a risk that it's believed that school are aware of something when actually they haven't been able to pick that up, or they haven't been able to process it in that right way. I think there is research. It is something that is quite aware of, I think, in terms of Operation Encompass. So I'm pretty sure there's research going on at the moment from the University of Central Lancashire, where they're looking at how this is affected. But I think it varies widely, and I think, as you say, sixth form colleges, and again that reflects really that as children get older, the impact on them of that person's abusive behaviours is seen as less serious. So older children are somehow less impacted by the abuse. So we see that in Operation Encompass, where as children move through the education system, you don't have that same emphasis on sharing information.
Good. Okay, thank you, Althea. So please keep your questions coming. We're going to move on now, and I'm delighted to introduce Russell Merry from Westminster. You're going to talk about the Safe and Together rollout. So Mary, over to you.
Hello, thank you. I am Mary Russell. I work in Kensington and Chelsea and Westminster in integrated commissioning. I commission public health services for children and young people. I'm a member of our VAUG strategic partnership, and I'm here with colleagues Emma and Ruby and Christina to talk about the partnership and how we work with children and young people. And I think we're really lucky that we have vibrant local strategic partnerships around VAUG with really diverse membership from the statutory sector as well as voluntary and community sectors too. We've developed a new VAUG strategy which has been co-produced by partners including survivors and residents, and those strategies have 4 key themes really, or principles, around preventing VAUG, supporting survivors, working in partnership and holding abusers to account. And the work of our partnerships are influenced by 6 operational groups, and one of those locally is solely dedicated to working for best practice for children and young people, and that group is snappily entitled the Children and Young People's Operational Group. So because that's a bit of a mouthful, we call it affectionately the CIPOG. But this is a group that I chair. It's a group of long-standing. We're linked in with local practitioners, but we're also linked in with local safeguarding children's partnerships and with the strategic partnerships. And the overarching aim of the Children and Young People's Operational Group is to ensure that response to domestic abuse in areas relating to children and young people is safe and effective and coordinated. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Ruby, who coordinates the CIPOG for us.
Thank you, Mary. Afternoon, everyone. As Mary stated, I'm the Children and Young People Operational Group Coordinator, and my role is commissioned by Public Health in all the 3 boroughs, so Westminster, RBKC and H&F, and it's provided by Standing Together Against Domestic Abuse, which is a national domestic abuse charity. So the operational group is based on the principle of the Coordinated Community Response, or the CCR, and it brings together local practitioners in order to share information, update on policies and good practice, and also to work towards a local action plan to collectively address and respond to domestic abuse. So we pride ourselves on having a very strong core membership, as well as a wide range of additional partners that attend that group. For example, we have representatives from local authorities, we have representatives from specialist services, and other voluntary agencies, and we also have reps from the police, mental health, acute health and community trusts, and they all either have child safeguarding roles or can disseminate the important information and resources shared during the SIPOG to the colleagues that are working directly with children, young people. So this broad membership and the established network of professionals help the 3 boroughs that we work across maintain an aligned and consistent approach to children and young people experiencing domestic abuse. And that is certainly exemplified in the rollout of the Safe and Together model. And Emma Biskupski, one of our core SIPOG members, will now provide some context as to how this model came to be in our local area.
Thanks, Ruby. So I'm Emma Biskupski and I manage the local Safeguarding Children partnership across both Kensington and Westminster. And a few years back, when our partnership was still a tri-borough partnership together with Hammersmith and Fulham, we had a really excellent presentation from our very valued partners at Standing Together. And they came forward and promoted the Safe and Together model to our local Safeguarding Children partnership. And that's really what they were highlighting to us was that this is a really useful child-focused and strength-based approach where the 3 key principles of that model are all about how we keep the child safe and together with the non-abusing, the non-offending parent, how we as organisations and workers can partner effectively with the non-offending parent as our default position, and how we can intervene effectively with the perpetrator to reduce the risk of harm to the child. And reducing the risk of harm for domestic abuse was a key priority for the Safeguarding Children partnership and remains so. And so the partnership members were really interested in the model and understanding a bit more about how it worked. And we really noted the use of language being really instrumental to encouraging the non-offending parents to work with us and to enable perpetrators to better understand the harm that they're causing and to take responsibility for it. So the partnership members could see how this fits really nicely with the model of systemic social work that we use across the 3 boroughs, as well as science and safety approach. And so the LSCP, the partnership, endorsed the rollout of the Safe and Together model. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague Christina from Hammersmith and Fulham, who's going to talk a little bit more about how they're getting on with that in their borough.
Thank you, Emma. Good afternoon, everyone. So as you heard, Safe and Together is an internationally recognised model of improving practice responses to domestic abuse within children's services settings. So I'm employed by Respect, and we have 5 other implementation leads like myself who are rolling this out across 11 London boroughs in total. It's also widely across Scotland, and the model originated in the US. So as Emma mentioned, the model really focuses, and I noticed when Althea was talking about some of the findings, how the model really speaks to a shift in language. So it really looks to hold perpetrators of domestic abuse accountable for their abusive behaviour, and really shifting away from placing responsibility on mothers or whoever is the non-abusive parent in a case, rather than case plans focusing on how the non-abusive parent should be keeping the children safe, really focusing on what behaviour we need to see shift from the perpetrator. And that kind of shift in language is so important, because if we effectively intervene with the perpetrator, we can directly reduce the risk and harm to the child. So the model really looks within our rollout. We do this via kind of training. So we offer training to practitioners across the borough. We offer training to partner agencies as well. So we're really not just looking at training social workers. We're looking at training at people at all levels within children's services and partner agencies that work alongside them. A big part of my role in implementation is doing case consultations. We find this so important for embedding the principles of the model that Emma mentioned, but also for shifting language within case plans, within child protection plans. It's really important to make sure that that accountability for the risk and harm is sitting with the perpetrator. And again, speaking to what came up earlier, one of the big things in the model is moving away from describing domestic abuse just as domestic abuse or conflict or arguments. We really want to break that down into what specific specific behaviours were witnessed? Was it shouting? Was it physical abuse? What type of physical abuse? It really needs to be broken down so that anyone who comes across this case, manager, supervisor, legal expertise, can look at that case and know exactly who was doing what to whom and where the risk and harm sits and who is responsible for that. And then a key part of this is intervening with the perpetrator. So once we've placed accountability with the perpetrator, we need to think about how we intervene with them. And within the rollout of this model, boroughs have access to a range of perpetrator interventions and different services. So as you can see there on the bottom of the slide, through the case consultations and through the rollout, we've had some great feedback from practitioners who are really finding that using the principles of the model has helped them to shift practice directly with families they're working with, partnering with the survivor, because it's really empowering for a survivor to see that actually children's services are recognising that the risk and harm is from the perpetrator and not holding them wholly responsible for keeping the family safe. It goes a long way for partnering with someone. And also the language of the model really encourages and supports workers to have those difficult conversations with perpetrators about, the accountability for the harm sitting with them and the need for change and the need for behavioural goals to be set. So that's just an overview of what we're doing. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, all our speakers. So we are going to move swiftly into the kind of Q&A section, and want to just remind you that at any point you can just put your hand up in MS Teams, add your question into the forum, and I will certainly allow you to speak and pose your question. So I guess as you're getting ready to do that, we'll just take a look at some of the comments that have come into the forum already. So there is certainly one about, well, maybe an easy one. Is there a Safer Together model for training available nationally? So is there national training available yet? I don't know who can answer that.
I'm happy to take that
Christine?
one. So Respect, the organisation I work for, we are looking to expand the model into other areas. However, primarily it's available within the 11 London boroughs at the moment and across Scotland. I believe there's some provision in Manchester, but please do get in contact with Respect if you'd like to find out more.
Excellent. And we'll certainly share the details with Respect to anybody who hasn't got that. So there is also a reaction about the experience of referral to MASH. Just going to find this. So frontline experience of trying to access support through referral to MASH, applying the threshold guidance in Lancs, Lancashire. So there's a big debate going on about Lancashire. Thank you for sharing that information. However, the guidance is patchy when it comes to domestic abuse. The Domestic Abuse Act 21 doesn't seem to have been embedded into practice thoroughly yet. So that's the experience of one or two people. What are your expectations around how the new act can be embedded and where people are getting to? Maybe some examples of where you feel that it is being fully implemented. Anybody wish to comment on that?
I can take that one. I think, because obviously that was something that we covered within the research for the panel, was asking areas in particular kind of what the Domestic Abuse Act meant for local child safeguarding systems and partnerships. And I would say that it varied, I think, again, reflecting that distinction between there's the domestic abuse partnership, there's the child safeguarding partnership, and it was seen as, oh, well, actually that's being managed over there. That's not for, as a child safeguarding system, that's not something we need to think about. We'll wait for them to tell us. And I think a mix of responses around what it meant for children to be named as victims in the Act, whether that meant a change in terms of the criminal law, or whether that was a more cultural change, and people feeding back that was already their culture of treating children as victims. Obviously, the main thing around the Domestic Abuse Act was around safe accommodation, and I just from my work outside of this as well, just seeing that a lot of areas in their needs assessments, that what they were picking up was that absence of services directly for children and young people. So I think the Domestic Abuse Act has been really instrumental in getting more specialist services for children and young people commissioned, because it's the needs assessment that is required by the Act has picked up those absences of services. but that is being managed from the domestic abuse partnership, from the community safety partnership. It's not always integrated with the safeguarding system. Again, it really risks being seen as a referral point rather than part of a multi-agency response to a whole family. So I think it does vary. I'll move on to Dale now. I can see she's got her hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Althea.
Yeah, really just kind of giving a kind of follow-up to sort of the since the review and what we've kind of seen, any differences. And I think, again, it's still a patchy picture in terms of what real impacts has the Act made. But what I would say, probably what I'm seeing more is a recognition that domestic abuse in relation to child safeguard needs to be looked at differently and through a specialist lens. So we're getting much more kind of reference to the fact that they are going to commission some specific work around this area. So I think there's a raising of awareness. We've not had many examples where we could say, well, practice has been changed to reflect the Act, or we are now doing this differently. So I think it's kind of a slow reaction, but I would say a realization that something needs to be done differently. And I think generally kind of referencing our briefing and saying we're now looking at this issue differently, which I think is a positive.
Thank you, Dale. I was just going to say that Althea, thank you for your response, but also for the comment in the forum talking about the domestic abuse, parental conflict, practitioners consistently reporting challenges and distinguishing the two. So you made that point very well. So I saw a hand go up, and it's Amanda McIntyre. Would you like to come off mute and ask your question?
Thanks. Brilliant event. Thank you very much. Amanda McIntyre from For Baby's Sake. We're one of the programmes that's mentioned in the back of the report as an example of good practice. And great, of course, to see our partners in Westminster, Kensington and Chelsea, Hammersmith and Fulham presenting at this event too. I really love the Venn diagram at the heart of the four core principles: domestic abuse informed, trauma informed, intersectional and whole family. It would be great to get, oh, thanks for putting it up there. It would be great to get the panel's perspectives about what it's going to take to really embed those four principles, including actually the intersectional one, which I think is really important in the mix. Thank you.
Great. Invite the panel to respond. There you go. Renica?
I was just going to build on your comment by saying that the centrepiece of our child protection in England recommendation is the concept of multi-agency teams co-located. And I think what this seminar actually highlights is how common domestic abuse is and the need for granular information, which will allow us to think about the needs and the risks of the whole family. And in relation to that, I think Derbyshire has put in a comment in the chat, the importance of multi-agency thinking together with the child being kept at the centre of decisions made. So I think what panel is wanting to do is really to highlight the need for multi-agency work in this territory so that we can actually get at the interventions that help every member of the family, including the perpetrator.
Yeah, thank you, Renica. Jaheen Davis, you got your hand up, and please just let us know where you're from.
I'm national panel, and it's Janine Davis.
I'm sorry.
That's fine. I look different every time. So I guess I was just picking up on the point around the four core principles and intersectionality in particular, and acknowledging that thinking about the findings of the report and I guess the silence or lack of analysis or lack of data, really exploring and, providing insight into intersectional experiences. And this is something we see not just in relation to domestic abuse, but actually just much more wider in terms of our, whether it's our rapid reviews or LCSPRs. And I think the starting point has to be an acknowledgement of the silence and where that silence comes from, and the confidence of safeguarding partners to discuss, to talk about it. It also is, there is something which again was explored within the report itself. Do you know your specialist organisations, those who, even though we know there is limited resource out there and we need more of those specialist organisations, but there's something about how often do you lean on and really learn and build upon that knowledge from specialist organisations who are set up, established to support and provide learning specifically for racialised and marginalised, wider marginalised communities. But I think when we talk about intersectionality, I think sometimes there's a tendency to use language such as, where we're saying domestic abuse, but not necessarily saying exactly what we mean or what harms we're talking about. I think that's true for when we talk about any intersectional experience. So we might see, reviews where it might just say cultural competence, and that's it. We don't actually know what that means, how it's applied in practice, who's that directed to, are we considering the bias of professionals, or any fear or concern or worries which actually influence the safeguarding practice, and are we considering the kind of wider intergenerational, transgenerational traumas of racialised and marginalised communities, and how that might impact on how comfortable and able they feel to share their experiences of harm. So I don't know if there is a specific answer. I think there is something about a willingness to acknowledge silence and engage in the silence, and to really ensure that when we're, learning from reviews, that we're also acknowledging that bias must also potentially, well, not even must also, we have bias in our society, in our communities, and we therefore have to be courageous to start considering how bias informs our decision making, and how potentially it is steeped in the experiences of those families as well as the professional network.
Thank you, Janine. That's a very useful answer, very inclusive. Dale, you have your hand up again. I don't know whether that's a legacy of previous. Do you want to come in on that as well?
Well, I was going to, but I'm just conscious of both Janine and I from the panel, so just we could talk about this and do talk about it at length between ourselves. I'm just conscious that I'll just give way to any other comments from.
Okay. Well, let's continue to request comments from the floor. Anybody who wants to put their hand up in MS Teams. There is another topic going on in the forum, which is about the perpetrator programs, and about the it says what kind of perpetrator programs do you refer to, and do you find them that are there enough available? There's also a kind of discussion going on about the shift from placing the onus on the non-abusing parent, usually the mother, to reduce risk and act protectively onto the perpetrator in taking accountability for their action as much needed. So that, along with perpetrator programs, what is your response about that? And Althea, you've got a response.
Yeah, I was just going to reflect kind of what we found from the research for the panel, which was kind of no one's likely to be surprised, but yeah, a real absence of perpetrator programs nationally. Some areas have got them very well established and embedded, and where they're there are great resources for safeguarding practitioners to involve them. Concerns that get a bit like the other specialist domestic abuse services for victims. They're seen as a signposting or referral point, at which point cases can then be closed, rather than seeing the work needing to go alongside. Obviously, most of the programs, they are voluntary. They require, and they are all for men at the moment, because we know that's the biggest group that we're dealing with in terms of those using abusive behaviours in intimate relationships and impacting children. So where there is then a lack of willingness on the part of that father or male partner to attend that programme, a lack of confidence, and a feeling of lack of expertise for safeguarding practitioners. Okay, what do we do now? And a real absence of training for safeguarding practitioners to work with those using abusive behaviours, either alongside a specialist perpetrator programme or without that. Obviously, there's also others like Drive, where it's that high risk, high harm abusers. So there's kind of two ends of the spectrum, but actually a lot of the fathers coming through the safeguarding system not necessarily being able, either program's not there or they don't want to go on that program. and what then do safeguarding practitioners do in terms of their role, and as I said, kind of a lack of confidence and a lack of training for them in doing that, which, given that domestic abuse in all of the cases is the volume issue for those coming through that front door, where that sits in terms of partnerships and the training programs that they develop, and the focus on domestic abuse where training is there, it's focused on the victim survivor, which then very easily leads into kind of holding them responsible. So I think, yeah, there is a real gap, but where they are there and where they can then be integrated into that safeguarding system, they're hugely valued for the role that they can play in changing that, supporting that person to change their behaviours, holding them responsible, and having a way of safeguarding the children. Was there another part to that? Sorry.
I think well, there was the training and also, but also there's a comment coming in which I think Sarah has put in about we did not see the use of DVPNs and DVPOs in the cases were reviewed, and the response to that is yes, of course, how the courts respond is integral to this in terms of the criminality or civil case that ensues, and how they're directed towards shifting those behaviours through the training programs.
Yeah, and obviously, yeah, so for some men, if they've been arrested, if they've been convicted, they may access a perpetrator program through probation called Building Better Relationships. But obviously, that's a very small minority of those causing harm, and at a fairly high threshold for conviction. And that's even for those victims and survivors who feel able to call the police, and linking back to what Janine was talking about, and that how we know that there are significant sections of our society who will not want to be contacting the police, and actually police need to be part of that multi-agency system, but they will deal with incidents. And when we focus on that, we are not looking at the whole picture and exploring the controlling and coercive behaviour. It's just a small part of that picture for that family, for the children, for the non-abusive parent.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we're of course rapidly running out of time, but thank you to Marie Humphreys, who's put in the comment about your experiences in Derbyshire, where you have a commissioned domestic abuse services. And please read that. It talks about the trialed and tested programme we have developed and implemented some changes to practice in both services. If it's possible, if you've got more information to share, maybe a web link or something to any online resource, Marie, that would be very useful. I just want to give people the chance, particularly the speakers today, to say any final words, and then I'll hand back to the panel and Dale to close us out. So just any final thoughts from Christina or Emma? Ruby? Okay, Althea?
Just to say thank you. It's been great to have the opportunity to discuss all of this and have the questions.
Excellent. And I think the purpose of these national panels are really to raise awareness and stimulate the conversation that we need to have about this, so that we can share those experiences around emerging practice, good practice. So thank you to all our speakers today. And I'm going to hand back to Dale just to kind of summarise what you've got from today and tell us about the next webinar. Dale.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I mean, I always find these webinars so fascinating. It's always, you know, you're running out of time. You can see all the really good conversations developing in the chat, etc. And I think what my takeaways, what make it so good, obviously thanking the speakers as you already have, is the fact that so much resonates. You know, you're seeing the questions and people saying, actually, that resonates. That's an issue we're having. This is what we're going to do. And thinking about the next steps. And obviously this is it's a huge issue, and I think Janine has really kind of highlighted, you know, just another layer of the complexity when we're dealing here with the cultural and context that also needs to be overlaid into any responses when you're considering how you create a coordinated response. And you know, the 4 principles, we had the question, I didn't come back in at that point, about what does that look like, but it does really look like a coordinated response. And it finds really rich for me, with my background with Standing Together in the past, to really be stressing, as I was in 2006 and I am now in 2023, the need for a coordinated response to domestic abuse, because it cuts across absolutely everything. And I think that's probably with 1 minute. That's it. And then I
Brilliant.
just hand over because I can't remember what the next seminar is on. Amina, just remind us what our next webinar is. I think this is it's either our second or third. I get confused because but Amina, what are we doing next?
We are doing bruising in non-mobile infants, which will be led by Peter Sidebotham and Sally Shearer on the Thursday, the 30th of March. It is currently sold out, but I do have a waiting list if anyone would like to attend that event and is not currently listed. We also have an evaluation survey for this event, which I will put in the chat, and I will email around the slides and also the link to the evaluation survey.
Excellent, thank you. And just finally, any of those presenters who want to just check back into the forum and respond to any of those questions, if you highlight it, you can then see the response. We'll put the response in and that will be published alongside the slides, as Emma mentioned. So we're on time. Thank you very much indeed for giving up the last hour, and look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thank you again to all our speakers and have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Bye all.
Thank you. Bye.